A father's serene homecoming turns into a tense public confrontation when a police officer's accusations spiral out of control, but the intervention of a courageous educator will change the course of events. Carlos Medina tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he glanced at the meticulously wrapped gift box resting on the passenger seat. Inside was a simply designed bracelet for his daughter Valeria, who would be turning 9 the next day. He could imagine the look of amazement on her face when she saw it. It had been an exhausting day. Her shift at the production plant had been longer than usual, but the thought of his daughter's smile made every minute of effort worth it. The sun was beginning to descend over the peaceful streets of Meow Brook, a small town in the state of Ohio. The rows of middle-class homes glowed with a warm golden light as Carlos rounded the bend on Oak Avenue. Suddenly, a series of red and blue lights began to flash, followed by the loud sound of a siren. A knot formed in his stomach. He wasn't going very fast. The taillights were working properly, and all the vehicle's documentation was in order. Without thinking, he slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road as his mind began to race. He rolled down the window and the officer approached. The officer was a man in his 40s with a stocky build, a stern look on his face, and a hand firmly planted on his gun. Carlos kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel, his voice calm as he greeted him. "Good evening, officer." "Is there an inconvenience?" the officer asked, leaning into the interior of the vehicle, squinting to take a better look at the driver's license and vehicle documents. He said in a brusque tone, "Where are you going?" Carlos hesitated for a moment. "I'm just going home, officer. I bought a gift for my daughter." The officer showed a slight smile, but there was no warmth in his face. "Get out of the vehicle," he ordered abruptly. As soon as Carlos opened the door, he realized this was not just a routine stop. He froze, still feeling his heart pounding as he watched the officer, who seemed to be trying to read his expression. But the man's face remained a cold mask of authority. Carlos slowly stepped out of the car, making sure his hands remained visible. He had taught Valeria how to handle situations like this, not to be afraid, but to be cautious. Now the lessons he had hoped he would never have to apply were replaying in his mind. The officer pointed towards the sidewalk. "Stand there," he ordered with an authority that brooked no argument. Carlos obeyed and stood there in the cool evening air as the officer began to circle around the car, his flashlight illuminating the vehicle. Carlos saw several neighbors peeking out from behind windows, shadows moving inside. "What's going on, officer?" Carlos asked, keeping calm but firm. He wasn't going fast, and everything was in order. The officer stopped, turned around and squinted his eyes. "You look suspicious," he answered bluntly. "We've received reports of robberies in the area." Carlos's stomach twisted. He had heard those words before, although not directed at him, but at others in the same situation. He had seen the videos, read about similar stories, always the same script, only the faces changed. "With all due respect, officer, I have done nothing wrong," he replied. The officer paid no attention and leaned into the car, taking out the gift bag, opening it, and checking its contents as if searching for something illicit. Carlos's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. A small group of onlookers began to gather, some with their phones in hand, recording what happened. Carlos noticed a man muttering something to the person next to him, both wearing expressions of confusion and discomfort. "Is all this necessary?" Carlos asked again, this time in a firmer voice, overcoming the murmur of the crowd. "Shut up," the officer ordered, pointing at him. "Let me do my job." But the officer's actions were not only attracting stares, they were beginning to generate palpable tension among the growing crowd. The air felt charged, as if every second stretched endlessly. Carlos stood motionless on the sidewalk, his heart racing as the officer continued to inspect his vehicle. The gift bag now rested carelessly on the passenger seat, the ribbon undone, and the bracelet for Valeria uncovered. Carlos's mind flew to his daughter, imagining her at home, wondering why he had not yet returned. The officer closed the door with a bang and turned to Carlos, focusing the flashlight on his face. "What are you really doing here?" he asked in an accusing tone. "I told you," Carlos replied with determination, without hesitation. "I was buying a gift for my daughter. That's all." The officer took a step closer, reducing the distance between them. "You're telling me that you just happened to be in this neighborhood at this time of night? How convenient." Carlos took a deep breath, feeling the stares of the onlookers on him. Now he could see their faces, a mixture of curiosity, concern, and bewilderment. One woman whispered something to her friend, pointing at the officer while a man muttered, "This doesn't look right." "I live only a few minutes away from here," Carlos replied, staring at the officer. "Check my license. Everything you need is there." But the officer didn't move. Instead, he placed his hand on his hip, brushing against the holster of his pistol. Carlos's stomach tightened, realizing how quickly this situation could escalate. He raised his hand slightly, palms outward, a gesture of surrender that he found as humiliating as it was essential. "Don't move," the officer ordered. Although Carlos had not made any movement, the murmurs of the crowd intensified, their discomfort turning into growing indignation. A young woman with a phone in her hand raised her voice. "This is wrong! He's not doing anything!" Her shout broke the officer's concentration for an instant, piercing the tense atmosphere. The officer turned toward the growing crowd. His tone was authoritative, but the insecurity in his voice was beginning to become evident. The cameras were still rolling, their lenses silently capturing every movement and every word. But just as the officer turned his gaze back to Carlos, someone in the crowd stepped forward, changing the course of the night. From the edge of the crowd, a voice cut through the growing tension, clear and unwavering. "Officer, I know this man." The heads in the crowd turned toward the source of the voice, a woman in her 40s who advanced with a presence that exuded calm authority. Her tone was serene but firm. She wore a cardigan and jeans, with her credentials still hanging from her belt. She was a respected teacher at the local high school, known and valued in the community. The officer hesitated, his hand lowering slightly from his hip. "Ma'am, step back," he said, but his tone was less firm now. "I am not interfering," she replied, stopping a few steps away from the scene. "I just want to make it clear that this man, Carlos Medina, is the father of one of my students. He is not a threat. He is a good man." She began to whisper to him, and Carlos turned his head slightly toward her. Now he recognized her, the pretty Mrs. Palmer, one of Valeria's favorite teachers. Valeria had always spoken highly of Mrs. Palmer's fairness and compassion, and now there she was, defending him. The officer tensed up, feeling that his authority was being challenged. "This does not concern you, ma'am," he said. Although his tone betrayed a slight doubt, he continued. "It concerns all of us," she replied firmly, her gaze fixed on him. "This is our neighborhood. I know who belongs here, and I know he belongs here." Her words echoed through the crowd, which began to rally in support. "He has done nothing wrong," shouted a man from the sidewalk. "We are all watching," added a younger woman. The officer looked around, clearly nervous, as what had once been a quiet street was now filled with stares and phones recording his every move. Mrs. Palmer moved closer to Carlos, stopping just a few steps away from him. "If there is no evidence of a crime, I think it's time to release him," she said. Carlos felt a surge of gratitude, but remained calm. His voice was firm when he said, "Thank you, ma'am." The officer, however, was not ready to give up the fight. His pride and authority kept him on his feet, unwilling to back down. Without wanting to let himself be defeated, he tried one last attempt to regain control of the situation. His face hardened even more. His jaw clenched as he watched the crowd. The pressure of so many eyes on him was evident. He turned again to Carlos and Mrs. Palmer, and with a sharp, high-pitched but hesitant voice, said, "Step back, ma'am, or I'll have to arrest you for interfering with police work." The crowd erupted in a clamor of protest, the voices rising in a single chorus. "Arrest her?" "Why?" shouted a voice from the crowd. "This is an abuse of power," added another. Mrs. Palmer didn't move an inch. "I'm not interfering," she replied firmly and calmly. "I am here as a witness, just like everyone else." With a gesture, she indicated the neighbors who had now gathered around, some with their phones recording, others simply observing. The officer, visibly puzzled and disconcerted, left his hand near the radio, but seemed to know that every second of confrontation could be an even bigger mistake. He looked at Carlos once again, looking for some reason to continue with the arrest. But Carlos remained still, with his hands raised in a sign of calm and his composure intact in the face of the growing tension. "I have complied with everything," Carlos said in a firm voice. "You checked my car, saw my license. What else do you need?" The question hung in the air without an answer that could justify the situation or crumble the officer's facade of authority. The officer hesitated, looking back and forth between Carlos, Mrs. Palmer, and the numerous eyes of the observers. Cameras seemed to multiply, each one recording every moment, every second of the interaction. Finally, with an almost imperceptible sigh, he took a step back. "You may go," he muttered in a barely audible voice amidst the bustle of the crowd. He turned and walked quickly back to his patrol, his tense shoulders leaving the scene behind, his pride visibly damaged. The atmosphere was still charged, but the immediate danger had disappeared. Carlos slowly lowered his hands, freeing himself from the tension that had kept him rigid. He took a deep breath, exhaling the air he had been holding back during the entire ordeal. Mrs. Palmer turned to him, her face softening. "Is she all right?" she asked, her voice full of genuine concern. "I will be," he replied, although his voice was laden with pent-up emotion. He looked at Mrs. Palmer and added, "Thanks to you, indeed." Before he could say more, the crowd burst into applause. The atmosphere, which had previously been tense and fraught with uncertainty, had now transformed into a space of collective relief. Carlos felt a mixture of relief and disbelief for a moment. He simply stood there, letting the reality of the situation settle in. But the night was not yet over. What had just happened would have repercussions in the community in ways that no one could have anticipated. As the officer drove away in his patrol car, the energy among the crowd changed. Relief mingled with anger, and voices rose in passionate discussions. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others spoke of their own encounters with similar situations. The shared frustration created a sense of solidarity, an unspoken agreement that this was not just Carlos' struggle, it was everyone's struggle. Mrs. Palmer stood by Carlos's side, her constant and reassuring presence. "You shouldn't have to go through this," she said softly, her tone charged with anger and sadness. Carlos nodded, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the gift bag in the car. "I'm just glad Valeria wasn't here. I don't want her to grow up thinking this is normal." A young man in the crowd stepped forward, holding up his phone. "I have everything on video," he said. "We need to make it known. People need to see what happened tonight." Others agreed, and some neighbors exchanged contact information, determined to unite and take action. Conversations about police accountability, systemic problems, and the need for change filled the air. The moment had ignited something bigger than anyone expected. Ms. Palmer took the floor in her calm but determined tone. "We have to do more than just upload this to the networks. We must act. This community deserves better, and Carlos deserves better." Her words also resonated with the group, and quickly many nodded in agreement. Carlos felt a torrent of gratitude as he watched the faces of his neighbors, people he had never met before, who had been strangers to him up to that moment, but who had now stood up to support him at such a vulnerable time. Yet there was also a lingering sense of frustration, a question hammering at the back of his mind. Why did it have to be so difficult? Why did it take a crowd, a camera, and a valiant person to secure his well-being? As the crowd began to disperse, Carlos turned to Mrs. Palmer. "Thank you for intervening," he said. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been there." She returned a warm smile. "We are all part of this community, Carlos. If we don't stand up for each other, who will?" But the true weight of that night would not be fully revealed until the days and weeks that followed. In the days following the incident, the video recorded that night quickly spread through social media, portraying the story as a clear example of abuse of police power and as a demonstration of the power of action. Carlos's face appeared everywhere, his calmness under pressure becoming a symbol of strength. But for Carlos, it wasn't about being a symbol. What really mattered was protecting his family and making sure that Valeria grew up in a world where she didn't have to fear moments like that one. That night, as they sat at the kitchen table, he explained the situation to Valeria in a way that she could understand. "Sometimes people make the wrong decisions because they don't take the time to really get to know others," he said. "But we must always stand up for what is right, no matter how difficult it is." Valeria looked at him intently, her small hands resting on the bracelet he had given her. "But you were brave, Daddy," she said with a smile. "And the lady helped you." Carlos nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "Yes, and now it's our turn to help others too." Meanwhile, the community came together in ways that Carlos had not anticipated. They organized meetings with neighbors to talk about how to address systemic problems and how to strengthen the community by making it more inclusive. Mrs. Palmer took the reins of the initiative by proposing programs to educate both residents and local authorities about prejudice. Change doesn't happen overnight, she said at one of the meetings, but it starts when we refuse to look the other way. The police department, under the pressure of public scrutiny, initiated an internal review into the actions of the officer involved. Although Carlos did not hold out much hope that justice would be done, he appreciated the fact that at least a conversation was taking place, a small but significant step. For Carlos, the most important thing that came out of that night were the connections that were created. Neighbors who had previously been strangers to him now greeted him as he passed by. Some stopped to chat about their shared vision of the future. Valeria had made new friends from families who previously didn't even know her name. Carlos felt, for the first time in a long time, cautious hope. One afternoon, as the sun was slowly setting on the horizon, Carlos stood in his backyard watching Valeria play. Mrs. Palmer walked by carrying a small box of homemade cookies. "I thought you might like these," she said with a warm smile. "Thank you," Carlos replied, accepting the box. He hesitated for a moment before adding, "Not only did you help me that night, but you reminded me that we are not alone." Mrs. Palmer nodded, her face showing a thoughtful expression. "None of us are alone. Sometimes it takes a moment like that to show us how connected we really are." In that moment, Carlos understood something profound. Even in the face of injustice, there was power in unity, in raising our voices and believing that change, though slow, is always possible. If this message resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because change begins when we unite and speak out. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire conversation in action.